Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Susan Hoffman, the director of UC Berkeley's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. We have our colleague from the Haas School of Business, Robert Strand, who's going to talk. This talk is called, "Is the American Dream a Nordic Reality?" Like most times when we have a speaker event, you will see that his talk is recorded and it will be posted once we've had a chance to caption it and post it online, both on our website and on our YouTube channel. We urge you to share it with as many people as possible because I think you will find the ideas today pretty exciting. We will also take your questions. Unlike most other speaker events, we have a hybrid audience. We have an invited audience here in OLLI's Suite 365, and we have yourselves zooming in live stream. We're glad that everybody's here, and we will take people's questions in the chat room. And then for our live audience, Robert will reiterate their questions to him. So in order to introduce Robert, we have a very special guest to make that introduction. And she is the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute's patron donor, Barbro Osher. As you know, she's the Swedish Consul General in San Francisco and has been a well-known and highly respected philanthropist in arts education, arts and culture, and even more important to our purposes, one of the funders in higher education. And some of the initiatives that she's funded at Berkeley, they first have funded 127 Osher Institutes across the country, but they've also funded scholarships at Berkeley for matriculating students, reentry students. They've supported Scandinavian studies, the J School, the Journalism School, and now generous seed funding for the Nordic Center, which you are now about to hear more. Barbro Osher.
Thank you. It's a big privilege to be here to talk to you today. I wish I were a student with you, not a speaker. This program is actually more or less modeled after a Nordic version of lifelong learning. It's either the, organizations that do lifelong teaching and the universities. So I feel it's such a great thing that we should know that we can study way up in our years. And welcome to this session. It's going to be about the Nordic countries. And let me tell you that I have ties to every Nordic country, which are in fact 5, plus the Baltics, which are the 3 Baltic states across the sea in the Baltic. So it's Sweden, I start with Sweden, of course, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland. And it's long been a deep interest for me to try to talk about what is it that makes up the Nordic idea, the Nordic model. We will have an incredible speaker today. I know him since quite a few years, Mr. Nordic. No need to call him anything else because he's like a preacher for the Nordic nations. And am I grateful to him? You bet. So without further ado, Dr. Robert Strand, Mr. Nordic.
Wow. What a lovely introduction. Barbro, thank you so very much. Susan, thank you so much. Yes, I have the great privilege to have this title of Mr. Nordic bestowed upon me from, dare I say, Ms. Nordic, Barbro Osher. And the only title that I'm more proud of than Mr. Nordic is that of Dad, of Mikkel and Jonas. So I hold this in very high regard. I am so grateful to be with all of you good folks here today. I'm going to pull up my presentation. If I do my job, and I hope I do, if I do my job, we'll have some time at the end, a few minutes for questions and my effort at a response to them. So please use the chat feature, and Susan is kindly scurried off and will be curating questions throughout. And folks here, if you have any questions, I'll iterate them back. All right. This is a deliberate, dramatic pause. Is the American dream a Nordic reality? Is the title for today's talk. And I'll just start just to plant a seed. I grew up in the great state of Wisconsin, here in America, of course, and had the privilege many years later to go to Norway on a Fulbright scholarship. And my experiences in Norway, and then later on in Denmark as a PhD student turned professor, my experiences in the Nordics, frankly, revolutionized my American mind. I saw things working in the Nordic countries that I had previously been told, oh, that's socialism, or that'll make people lazy, all that education, all that healthcare. And these are things that I came to realize, actually, it's the opposite of that. These are very efficient societies. And that also speaks to a bit of my educational background. Came out as an industrial engineer, efficiency. And I've come to realize what incredible inefficiencies we have in American society, because we say, if you try to do something together at a societal level, it has to be socialism. No. And so I want to flip this idea of capitalism on its head, and looking at what is American capitalism compared to other varieties of capitalism, because there are capitalisms, and the Nordic region is practicing a different variety of capitalism than what we have here in the United States. And I think, just drawing from my experiences as an industrial engineer, what a great benchmarking opportunity. Let's go out and look in the world to see where there's some strong performances and see what we can learn from it. So before I dig into that, as Barbro shared with you, I'd like to say a couple words about this entity that I am so proud to be part of, and that is the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley. We just launched it this year. And thanks to the Barbro Osher Pro Suecia Foundation and the Bernard Osher Foundation, we have 2 years of seed funding. So I'm just going to plant the seed with you, good folks. We, in order to ensure that the Nordic Center at UC Berkeley can live on beyond these 2 years, we have an endowment campaign. And for $1 million of core funding a year, we need $25 million endowment. So that's what Mr. Nordic is working on these days, is to secure the financing to ensure that the Nordic Center can survive and thrive. And to the degree that you like today's conversations, I really hope that you sign up for our mailing list. So Nordic Center Berkeley, at this place, Google will bring you to this website. That's the Nordic Center website at the UC Berkeley domain. And then all you do is put in your name and your email there. And you can stay up to date with the things that we're doing. Okay, I'll come back to that later on here. But first, some of you good folks have had the misfortune of seeing me talking before here at OLLI. And I feel very fortunate that I got asked back again. And this is what I drew from last year, a thing that said, Sustainable Vikings, what the Nordics can teach us about reimagining American capitalism. I'm very proud and happy to say that I can now cross that in progress and say it's done. After 5 years of a labor of love, I've completed this book, some editing to be done, but now it's off in the hands and being evaluated by the University of California Press. And I'm very, very hopeful. And I'll also like to call out my wonderful students that I have the privilege to have gotten to know here at UC Berkeley at the undergraduate, MBA, and executive MBA levels, because they are now part of this book. They have been helping me by reading drafts of this book for all the courses that I have the privilege to teach here at Berkeley. And they're all titled the same thing. They're all titled Sustainable Capitalism in the Nordics, question mark. And I just returned from Copenhagen with a group of 30 of our MBA students from Berkeley, where we dug into this topic firsthand. Trying to get a glimpse here to see what other varieties of capitalism are out there in the world. How do they work? And what might we learn from that here in the United States? Now, to give you a sense for this book, this is the table of contents. 10 chapters. And for today's talk, I'm really going to be drawing from this particular chapter. Chapter 7, at the societal level, American dream is the Nordic reality. That's my argument that I put forth in chapter 7, from which I'll be drawing. Now, I also would like to start, though, by drawing out in chapter 10, because in chapter 10, I come to a conclusion of 10 lessons that I believe America can draw from the Nordics. And I'd like to share those lessons with you because they're particularly relevant. And one of those is particularly emphasized in that chapter 7. And here is the kind of so what of it all, so to speak, the 10 lessons that I come to argue in the final chapter, where I argue the Nordics are our North Star for America. And I just want to emphasize, metaphorically speaking, a North Star, it's not perfect. The North Star, it kind of wobbles up there. And the North Star is not a destination. Nobody ever set sail on the ship. The Vikings didn't say, let's go, seafare to the North Star. No, it's a guide. It helps you to achieve something, some direction you're trying to get to, some place you're trying to get to. And I would argue that America, we're not living up to our potential. And to fulfill our potential, our great potential of the United States of America, means that every single one of our citizens needs to have the opportunity to fulfill their own potential. And I believe the Nordics can be a North Star for us to help to get to that destination. As flawed as the Nordics are, just as there is no utopia on this planet, but they can be a device that we can compare ourselves with and learn and challenge ourselves. And I emphasize that also because here with American audiences, I'll emphasize the virtues of the Nordics to constructively challenge us. But when I'm with Nordic friends, I'm going to critique them. I'm going to critique the hell out of them because they're not perfect, far from it. And we need to be able to learn from one another. So that's largely also what the Nordic Center is to do, is to build this global platform here at the University of California, Berkeley, to shine a bright global spotlight on the Nordic region, with the idea that we in America have a lot to learn and can constructively challenge ourselves, and the Nordics need to be challenged and pushed forward. So of these lessons that I come to in chapter 10 of this book, lesson 5 is the one most relevant for today. And it might not make sense right away, but I'm going to come back and hopefully it does by the end of this talk. And that lesson 5 is expand the positive freedoms for all, not just the negative freedoms for the powerful few. I'll come back to that. I recognize it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Hopefully it does by the end here. All right, chapter 7, here's how I kick it off. I started with a quote by, this is the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin. And she said a couple of years ago at the World Economic Forum, I feel the American dream can be achieved best in the Nordic countries, where every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, can become anything. All right, I like that quote. It begs the question. So what is the American dream? What are we even talking about here when we say the American dream? Now, I've drawn in my book, and just generally speaking in life, inspiration from this particular offering. The American Dream, a book by Jim Cullen, roughly 2004 with Oxford, published it, a short history of an idea that shaped a nation. Now, when we talk about the American Dream, Jim Cullen offers a few varieties. There are different American dreams. But one common theme that seems to arise throughout most of these ideas of the American dream is this idea of the dream of the good life, meaning an upward mobility. We also like this phrase, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that upward mobility. You have the freedom to become anything you want, provided you put in the hard work. This is at the heart of the American dream. And anybody has the freedom to become anything you want, provided you put in the hard work. That's the narrative. It's the American dream. Okay, let's hold on to that here. And I'm going to move to a wonderful report, and I draw from a number within this book, but I'll just emphasize this one, World Economic Forum, the Global Social Mobility Report, Equality, Opportunity, and a New Economic Imperative. World Economic Forum, just a couple years ago. and looking at this idea of mobility and trying to come up with some measurements of mobility. And first off, why does it matter? Social mobility, what is it and why does it matter? And this idea of social mobility means that people can move up and down in society. So you're not just by birth necessarily, oh, you're born to this particular family, so that means this is what you are going to be in life, equal to that family. But you could actually maybe work a little harder and move up, or maybe you're lazy and then you move down. But that mobility, and there's kind of an idea of an underlying implicit idea of a meritocracy. Work harder, move up. Don't work as hard, move down. This sort of an idea. Now, the World Economic Forum drew from a number of researchers here, and I found this very helpful. Different dimensions of social mobility. So there can be intra-generational mobility, and that is an individual who move between socioeconomic classes within their own lifetime. There's intergenerational mobility. So if you're born to parents of a particular means, could you move up or move down from them? And there are a few other ideas of mobility. Absolute income mobility, absolute educational mobility. Is it only folks whose parents went to college that they go to college in a society? If it only folks that have that didn't go to college, if their kids aren't going to go to college, this would be an example where there's not much mobility. Income mobility, relative educational mobility, a number of ideas of different ways to measure mobility. Okay, and they measure this by country. And you could say that this idea of social mobility index measured by country, you could kind of also call it, I like to call it, it's the American Dream Index. It's a measurement of how well is a society fulfilling this idea of the American dream. That if you put in the work, you can move up. And if you don't, you can move down. And lo and behold, when we look at the American Dream Index, an amalgamation of all these various forms of mobility, Barbro, you mentioned 5 nations before that comprised the Nordics. And well, I got number 1, Denmark, number 2, Norway, number 3, Finland, number 4, Sweden, number 5, Iceland. And then move down the list a little bit. Number 27, United States. Happens to be right next to Spain, just for your information. I purposefully blur the other countries here because I've been part of talks before, and inevitably all the time is talking about, why is Croatia right there? And I have no idea why Croatia is right there. But I look at the Nordics and I look at the United States, and there's certainly a story. This is just one of many of these sort of ratings. And every rating is flawed in its own unique way. But when you collect these baskets of ratings, this sort of index, and you can look at other things, happiness index, you can look at sustainability indices, you can look at democracy indices, and they tend to tell a story that the Nordics have some very strong comparative performance vis-a-vis the United States. And I emphasize comparative because everywhere is flawed in this world. And I want to avoid the nirvana fallacy, where we can point to the failures of a particular society to say that there's nothing to learn from that society. And I agree, there are failures, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn something. And I found something strikes me is that I am regularly part of, oftentimes at Barbro Osher's home and a number of others, where we receive groups from the Nordic countries who are coming to the United States to study us year after year after year. And they want to come to Silicon Valley, they want to come look at our universities. And there's no shortage of folks coming from the Nordic countries who want to learn from the United States of America. What strikes me is when I'm the American rolling around the Nordic countries saying, I want to learn from you, folks always seem surprised. Oh, what could we possibly have to? We've got to even this out, this learning from one another. And so this is part of the mission also of the Nordic Centers, to be that platform where we in the United States of America can learn from the Nordic region, just as they have prosperously learned from us here in the United States. Because obviously, we certainly have something to offer the world as well. I would just argue that it hasn't been an even exchange of learning. And given the current challenges that we face, the Nordics have something particularly important to offer in our learning. You got to ask yourself here, that narrative of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. How much is that just a narrative, a myth in American society? A cruel myth, perhaps. And the Martin Luther King comment about believing, and I believe that folks should pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. What are the sorts of things that we need to build to enable folks in a society to actually be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps? How can we make the American dream a reality for everyone? I think is a phenomenally interesting and important question. And this idea of the American dream, it's hard to not talk about ideas of freedom. And here we are with another narrative, the land of the free here in the United States. Now, I am particularly drawn to the offerings of Latvian-born philosopher and publican-elect Isaiah Berlin. And I'm going to admit to you, I didn't know who this was when I started this book 5 years ago, and maybe it was up to 3 years ago. I didn't know who this was, and I'm ashamed to admit that, but I also realized, oh, just this beautiful process of lifelong learning that OLLI represents. How little we all know. And so I approached this book as an opportunity to learn so much myself and give me a framework to force me to learn. And here is one of the greatest learnings that I have in the opportunity to write this book over these 5 years, is to learn from many of these great scholars in the world. And Isaiah Berlin, I'd put him at the very top of helping to inform my thinking and very much ideas of this thing called the American dream. This is where I'm going to come back. That lesson 5, expand the positive freedoms for all, not just the negative freedoms for the powerful few. This is one of the 10 lessons that I would say America can learn from the Nordics. And this idea of positive freedom vis-a-vis negative freedom. Isaiah Berlin wrote so eloquently, spoke so eloquently about ideas of freedom. And he delineated between ideas of positive freedom and negative freedom. And I find it very helpful. So I want to share that with you. A negative freedom, according to Berlin, is the freedom to do whatever one wants without constraints or regulation. It's the freedom from coercion and interference by others. And he compared this then to positive freedoms. Positive freedom is the freedom to realize one's full potential and the freedom to flourish. So negative freedom, you can remember freedom from something. Positive freedom, freedom to something. So when we think about expanding our negative freedoms, well, these are discussions about, I want to cut taxes. Taxes are coercion. I don't have a choice to pay them. I'm forced to pay them. Regulations on the books. I have to comply. You put that law in place, whatever it may be, I'm driving on the right side of the road. That has limited my negative freedom to some degree. What if I want to drive on the left side of the road? But negative freedom, expansion of negative freedoms. Okay, vis-a-vis that positive freedom, freedom to. And here we can talk about things like freedom to have access to education, freedom to access healthcare. These are positive freedoms. And oftentimes these positive freedoms also require systems to be established, to be put in place, to have access to them. You have to establish an educational system. You have to establish a healthcare system. You start to see where there might be some connections between the two, because how would you fund, for example, education that everyone has access to? Well, that's public education. You got to pay some taxes for that. So now you see there's a tension between the positive freedom expansions to expand that access to education for all. It's going to come at a reduction of some degree of negative freedom for individuals because they're going to have to pay taxes, for example. So there is inherently a tension here. And Berlin is so helpful to discuss negative freedom is really in the end a question about power. And that question, freedom for whom? And in the book, I unpack with the help of many others that the American experiment has largely been a focused experiment in expanding the negative freedoms. But when you talk about negative freedom, you have to talk about freedom for whom. And Berlin has a lovely quote here. Freedom for the wolves has often meant death to the sheep. The wolves, of course, being the powerful, and the sheep being the many people. And Alex de Tocqueville, in his democracy in America almost 200 years ago, remarking they, as in Americans, want equality and freedom. And if they can't have it, they still want it in slavery. We don't have to go back, and this argument has been used in many other fora, but if we go back to slavery, slave owners and folks advocates of slavery in the United States of America, talking about in terms of freedom. You can't take my freedom away to own other human beings as property. That's a violation of my negative freedom. And that discourse has been very strong in the United States of America. And that American dream kind of narrative comes in there too, because it's dangling, you too could own property and maybe whatever it may be. You too could have this. You don't have it right now, but you could have it as a sort of mythology. Now, when we look at positive freedom, this is by and large a characterization that we could talk about the Nordic experiment. And I say out of convenience, Nordic experiment. In reality, of course, it's a plurality. There are Nordic experiments. But Barbro, I've heard you say so many times before, within the Nordic region, we see our differences so much amongst the Nordic countries and the citizens. But the further away we are from the Nordic countries, the more alike we are. And I think that here in the United States, it actually is useful to talk about a Nordic model as a starting point to compare with the United States of America. And the Nordic experiment of the Nordic model, built largely throughout the 20th century, beginning in the late 1800s, first with employment insurance. So folks who got hurt on the job. And here the Nordics didn't invent this, they drew this from Germany. And many of these expansions of positive freedoms have been the Nordics themselves benchmarking out in the world. And then we look at access to education, universal access to education, universal access to healthcare. This was in the 1950s, largely the Nordics really worked on universalism and trying to make it for everyone. And I'd also like to point out, I think, a very interesting thought exercise. And I certainly use it in the classroom, and I'm inspired and I was learned by the conversations with our students. And that is the Nordic idea of freedom to roam. Freedom to roam laws across the Nordics really tell a different approach to property ownership, in particular land, than what we have here in the United States. And they describe, and it's a good example of the idea of positive freedom. Freedom to roam laws. In all the Nordic countries, laws on the books that you can walk anywhere you want, provided you stay at least 300 meters away from somebody's home. But somebody can own a whole lot of land, and you can go on their land and you can pick up sticks, you can pick up berries, you can forage for mushrooms, you can camp anywhere you want. In fact, Sweden was put on Airbnb for free in 2018, the entire country for free. Anybody can go there. And this was exemplifying this freedom to roam. Now, that is an expansion of every citizen in the Nordic countries' positive freedoms, access to roam, access to land. Now, it comes at a cost, because owning that property in the Nordic countries now, some folks' negative freedoms, the property owners, is slightly diminished. What if I want to own a big plot of land and I don't ever want to see anybody on there taking my mushrooms? Sorry. Your negative freedom has been slightly reduced. But this is the consensus that's been built. This is the deal that's been brokered in the Nordic countries, that on the whole, more people's freedoms are expanded. And the cost of those negative freedoms is not that egregious, where we think this is a good bargain to strike. Now you compare that to the United States, where you've got the no trespassing sign, you know, and implication that you might get shot if you actually walk on my land because I own that property, that's mine. We have a different idea of these sorts of freedoms. So freedom of roam, I think that's a really interesting one to dig into, and certainly stoked a lot of great conversations in the classroom. Now, this idea of positive freedom, though, it's not just for the Nordics. That's a gross characterization, if I implied that before. But we have some incredible institutions that are expansions of positive freedoms here in the United States of America. Our UC system and my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin system, and I would add to that our wonderful community colleges. These are expansions of positive freedoms. They require investment. So yes, they require some reduction of negative freedom in the form of some taxes. But what an incredible return on investment we've realized through things like the University of California, Berkeley, through institutions like the University of Wisconsin. These are American dream factories. Our public education in the United States of America, it's been our American dream factories. Okay. Now I want to talk about pit toilets. You didn't see that coming, did you? So I certainly didn't grow up in poverty, but I certainly didn't grow up in wealth. My parents are lifelong educators, and there was always an expectation. I knew it from the youngest of ages that I would pay my way through college. There was always an expectation put on me, you're going to go to college. It wasn't said explicitly, but I always wanted to go to college. I was always interested, and I was surrounded by educational mindsets, and I loved it. And my dad, when he went to a small university, I just remember always being drawn to university campuses. I just loved the life of it. So I knew that I would always go to college, and I knew that I was always going to be paying to go to college. And I could achieve that by cleaning these things. So this was my summer job while I was working my way through college. It was cleaning pit toilets at Merrick State Park in Fountain City, Wisconsin. And it wasn't the most glamorous of jobs, I can say. It was a little filthy at times, a little repulsive at times, but I never felt exploited, never. I never felt like I don't want to be doing this, because I knew what this led to. Cleaning those toilets led to education. And I go in the book here and I just pull some basic numbers. I was getting paid minimum wage. And if you look, 1995, that was the year that I started at the University of Wisconsin. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom row here. So this is a very simple index that I put together, that I put in the book, the Summer Job Tuition Index. And that is, how many summers do you have to work in order to pay your way through 4 years of school for tuition? 1995, it was 6. Now, I could save up. And I worked when I was early from 16, and I was delivering papers before that, and I put the money away, and so I could save up enough money to actually pay my way without going into debt, without going into some crazy amount of debt. Debt is a freedom killer in and of itself. But if we think about this idea of positive freedom, and we think about pull yourself up by the bootstraps, just work hard. Well, 1960 at the University of Wisconsin, the Summer Job Tuition Index was 2 summers. 1970, just 10 years later, 3 summers. Okay, now go 25 years later. 1995, 6 summers, so it doubled. Now go up to 2020. It now takes 12 summers of minimum wage work to save enough to pay for 4 years of tuition at the University of Wisconsin. And this is the trend. Because of dwindling public financing, because those taxes getting cut, and this was a deliberate effort, certainly in the state of Wisconsin, we can anticipate that by 2045, it'll take 24 summers of work. Now, obviously, that is impeding upon regular folks having access to education. And even in 1995, I was very lucky, because I said my family wasn't wealthy, but we weren't impoverished. And for those students who are in poverty, they don't have the luxury of being able to just pay their tuition. They've also got to pay for a place to live. They've also got to pay for their meals and all these sorts of things. And so one could make a strong argument that really the number should be back at that, probably that 1960 number of 2 summers. And here at the University of California, Berkeley, that 1960 number would have been 0 summers when tuition was still completely covered by the state. So when we talk about public education, great institutions like the University of California, Berkeley, like the University of Wisconsin, when we talk about pull yourself up by the bootstraps, as I was growing up, that narrative held. I could work hard, save money, and realize the American dream. And the University of Wisconsin was my springboard for life. And I feel so incredibly fortunate that I'm living the life that I am now. In many respects, that University of Wisconsin was a reason I could do so. But that opportunity is not there for others today. And day after day after day, it's less and less and less, the opportunity. So we have to think about how do we actually expand positive freedoms for individuals? And that often takes our investment. And I would argue, when we look at this American Dream Index, it's not that I'm ashamed that the United States is number 27 on the American Dream Index. But here's something that we have in the United States of America I want to appeal to. I feel competitive. I feel we are not fulfilling our potential. We have to invest. We should be number one on this index. And this is something that I feel very good about us wanting to compete in, is being number one on the American Dream Index. Insofar as the American Dream Index means that everybody has the opportunity to realize their own potential, to flourish, that access to. So in coming back here to Santa Marin, feeling that American dream can be best achieved in the Nordic countries, where every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, can become anything. A major part that the Nordic countries are performing so comparatively well vis-a-vis the United States is because of long-standing investments in education for all. And we can go back just a handful of generations and go back to when my great-great-grandparents left Norway in 1861, because there just weren't opportunities. They were starving. And they came to the United States of America and they settled in Wisconsin. And the opportunities that they were able to realize, that I benefit from today, those Nordic countries, even back when Knut and Anna Strand came to the United States in the mid-1800s, started to invest in education. And in Denmark, they started the folk school movement that spread across the Nordic countries. And that was to educate the peasants. And also, it's a very interesting story about democracy as well, because that's about the time that Denmark was turning from a monarchy to democracy. And many folks, particularly Grundtvig, a philosopher and pastor in Denmark, recognize, the people need to be able to have the skills to run a democracy. They need to have personal responsibility and responsibility for the community. And this idea, he drew from the Germans, Bildung, this idea that is very much also at the heart of OLLI, of lifelong learning, of fulfillment, of flourishing, of curiosity, and of humility, that also recognizes none of us achieves anything completely alone. We need one another. So I have to take individual responsibility and community responsibility. And that's actually a beautiful thing. And I can feel great fulfillment from that. And so the final paragraph here from this chapter 7, and then in a moment, we'll open up to some questions, comments, reflections. And please type in the chat. I can't tell you how embarrassing it is to be in a situation like this and there are no questions. And it happens to me, and then I feel very bad. And I don't want to feel bad today. So please put some questions and some comments in there, and Susan will kindly curate them. This final paragraph here: only when we commit ourselves to make the American dream a reality for everyone can we realize greater freedoms for everyone. Drawing lessons from the Nordics, we must build an America where every child, no matter their background or the background of their families, has the possibility to become anything. And with that, I'll remind you, Nordic Center. Type that in, Nordic Center Berkeley in Google, sign up for our mailing list. And if any of you have any further questions or comments or potential support for the Nordic Center, my email, hopefully somewhat memorable, it's mrnordic@berkeley.edu. So with that, I'll bring this to a close, and then would love to hear any questions, comments that any of you good folks have.
Robert, thank you very much. Are there any questions in the live audience that anyone wants to pose?
Are there any questions here? We'll go first to the chat, and then I have some friends here. If there aren't in the chat, you'll save me, right? Okay, good.
Great.
Let's go to the chat first, please.
All right. Well, then one of the first questions, it was a series of questions that Laura was asking. The naming of anything is always of such great importance. And so the question is deciding to call it the Nordic Center rather than the Scandinavian, center is part of her first question. The second part is, and people are responding to her in the chat, is there for her, and she thinks from her generation that there is an association with Nordic being superior and something that is used very cautiously. So I'm certain you've thought about that, but if you could respond to why did you call it the Nordic Center?
Yeah, thank you. Excellent question. And I'll say that it's something that we want to address head on with the Nordic Center. So I'll say first off, why the Nordic Center? I've used Scandinavia for a long time in my life. I've come more recently in the last few years to use Nordic, largely because there is an entity called the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is a formal collaboration between the governments of these Nordic countries, these 5 countries that were mentioned before. And that's helpful to have a firm definition. It's actually, Scandinavia can get a little contentious. Who's in, who's not? Some questions, is Finland included? Is Iceland included? And I tend to use the terms myself, rightly or wrongly, interchangeably, Scandinavia and Nordic. But we went with Nordic Center largely because there is a formal definition here. And because, for example, when President Barack Obama in 2018 convened or 2016 convened the heads of the states, the Nordic states in DC for a Nordic summit, they were using that term, Nordic. And this is something it's starting to coalesce, and for the recognition that many of these countries recognize, we're a lot mightier together. So on a global stage, they're using this moniker Nordic, so we're mirroring that. But arguably of more importance here is this ugly connection between Nordic identity and white supremacy. And frankly, I want to address this head on. And when we talk about ideas of capitalism, we can't help but address this head on. When we look at property rights and histories of property rights in America and structural racism, they're right there, they're apparent. I can look at my own history. I mentioned Knut Strand, my great-great-grandfather coming from Norway in 1861. Lo and behold, in 1862, poof, he was given land. Why? Well, because he was a white man. In Norway, where he was just a Norwegian, and this is a James Baldwin quote, so in Norway, they were just Norwegians, but when they came to America, they became white. And another quote from Baldwin, and white is a metaphor for power. And that certainly is the case here. We actually believe that the Nordic Center could be a platform to discuss and deliberate ideas of white supremacy and how embedded it is in our system of American capitalism. And it's something that we don't want to run away from. So we recognize this is a very sensitive area, and we need help in figuring out how to engage in a sensitive but serious manner. But we think that this is something that the Nordic Center could also be a platform for these sorts of deliberations as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Your presentation is making for some comment too in the chat room, wishing you could talk to Congress and explain the freedoms too, and the freedoms for the.
Susan, could I say something on that?
Absolutely.
I had a chance, and this is in the small little area, and here's my 15 seconds of fame, was I had a chance to go to Congress. Just we didn't know that COVID was kicking off, but it was December of 2019. And to talk about these Nordic ideas and to share what I believe could help America realize greater freedoms. And I'd be happy, Susan, to share the video of that, because I got a lot of pushback from some of our congressional friends. And in just describing about how the Nordic business community has been champions of these universal education, of universal healthcare, of these sort of positive freedom expanders. The Nordic business community and collective bargaining and unions, Nordic business leaders throughout the 20th century have been champions of these ideas and ideas of, you know what, for us to all thrive, we must all prosper, shared prosperity. And the fights that I see fought oftentimes in American business community, and certainly since the 1980s on, is cut my taxes. That's the lobbying at the federal level of many corporations, is to get to zero taxes. And many of our biggest corporations do pay zero taxes. And I went to this congressional committee. It was the Small and Medium-Sized Business Committee. And I thought, if there's a group that would be receptive to hearing ideas, the Nordics have said, look, I want to run a business. I don't want to be in the business of having to allocate healthcare to my employees. Healthcare is a real burden for American business. And in the Nordic business community, they can just focus on doing what they know best, and that's business. And when I came to this idea, I thought I could appeal to folks in the small, medium-sized business committee to say, you know, there's a more efficient way to do healthcare than have all these disparate forces engage with it. You can actually have some efficiencies at it. Well, a lot of pushback. And I realized then that I need to really work on my language. And this is where I deliberately talk about capitalism in the title of my book, because I want to be I'm not talking about socialism, the boogeyman word. I'm talking about capitalism. But I've got a ways to go here, and I invite all input on how I can do that more effectively. And if I get another chance to talk to such a committee at Congress, maybe I'll have some greater success than what I realized the first go around.
Robert, thanks for that reminder, because I do remember that congressional testimony, and we did share it with the OLLI members, but it would be good to share it with them again. Warren has asked the question, could you provide your perspective on Yantas Law? Am I pronouncing that right?
Janteloven?
Yes, and
Yeah.
how that compares to the American ideal of being a self-made man.
Wow, that is a great comment, and what a juxtaposition. And here's where there are so many commonalities when we talk about the Nordics and the United States. And both places measure as being very individualistic, and that can surprise some Americans. Individual personal responsibility is an important thing in the Nordic countries as it is in the United States here. But a big difference is the individual, how much one boasts on one's own behalf. How much do you tout and tell your story? And the self-promoter across the Nordic region is largely frowned upon. And there's this idea of janteloven, and it translates to Yantas Law. And it was a Dane who was living in Norway in the 1930s, wrote this great book, and it was about this little town called Janta, and it had 10 laws. And law number 1 effectively said, you are not special. Law number 2 effectively said, you are not special, don't think you're better than us. Law number 3 effectively said, you are not special, do not think you are better than us, exclamation point, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This idea that the tall poppy gets whacked. That's janteloven. Now, compare that here to the United States of America. And when I first went to Norway, oh, those poor people, I scared a lot of people, because here comes this loud talking American, and I'm talking about all the things that I want to do, and that shook folks up a bit. But I've come to realize that this American self-promoting thing, provided it's channeled for a good purpose, it can be an effective tool. And so I now have come and I embrace this title of Mr. Nordic. And that is very un-Nordic of me. Nobody in the Nordic countries would actually title themselves Mr. Nordic and go around talking about the Nordics. But I came to realize, you know what? Maybe that's where I can play a role in this world, is being that loudmouth American who's in the Nordic countries talking about on behalf of what the Nordics have to offer the world, so that I can challenge us here in America, where we're used to loud talkers. And if you're not talking loud, nobody's going to listen to you. So I'm serving that kind of cheerleader role here in the United States to critique things, violating janteloven. But then I can also go into the Nordic countries and use that same kind of American thing to challenge them and say, you know what, you maybe didn't sign up to be #1 in this American index or #1 in the world in the Sustainable Development Goals Index, but here you are. And you're not performing as well as we need you to perform. And we need strong leadership in this world. We need inspiration. So we need you. So here I've come to find my way in this world, that this is a role that I can play. as Mr. Nordic, while recognizing I am violating this janteloven left and right.
That is, so you are cultural fusion strategy here. That's great. So the comments from Joseph is that these Nordic countries are very expensive places to live. And would that be a necessary part of the vision to have an equitable society?
Yeah, if I could just edit that comment, it's a very good comment, expensive places to live. I'll edit it to say they're very expensive places to visit.
Okay.
Because when you're a visitor in a country, of course, and even if you're living somewhere for a year or two, yes, the prices of groceries, for example, are a bit more. A Big Mac does cost more in Copenhagen. It's about 7-10% more than a Big Mac in the United States. So it's more. There are a lot of other things that are really expensive. You buy a bottle of wine in Norway, and that's going to set you back a couple of weeks. When I was in Norway as a Fulbright scholar, my stipend was $18,500 a year, and a pint of beer was $13. And so that was, and I like to drink beer. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I couldn't afford that many beers. So it's very expensive to be there for a short period of time, and certainly as a tourist. But when you live there and you realize that all this money that typically comes out of your American check for healthcare, all this money that you're trying to squirrel away for your kids' daycare, for your kids' tuition, these are all things that are actually, through higher taxes, are actually saved for. And so in the end, out of the whole, you look at how much money do you have in your pocket when you're paying out of pocket for all these medical things in the United States, vis-a-vis those things are coming in tax dollars and you're using, it's a bit of a wash. And in fact, there's some strong evidence that things might be on the whole just slightly cheaper in the Nordic countries because of greater efficiencies realized. So because of coordinated healthcare, in Denmark, they spend about 10% of their GDP on healthcare annually. In the United States, we spend about 19% of our GDP on healthcare. And newsflash, we're not getting better outcomes. And so we actually can realize some efficiencies in some of these universal systems that actually in the end then mean a little bit less money taken out for taxes than what you would have paid out of pocket if you just had to buy these services on your own. So
Good
live
point.
there. I guess that's my primary
Sure.
point. Move to the Nordic countries and have children and have them go to universities and utilize the healthcare. That's my fundamental point there.
Or make friends in Norway and visit them.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the best advice that somebody told me once is, Robert, you really need to just marry a Norwegian. That would actually be, and the scary part is I don't know if my wife would actually be against that. I want to keep my wife. So I'm happy here, but being able to have the opportunity to spend some time there each year too.
Well, some of the questions that are coming up in the chat are what else can we learn from the Nordic countries about how they are defending democracy and the threat of authoritarianism. Can you make a comment on that?
Yes, I think this is, if you read through those 10 lessons that I have that the United States, I believe, can draw from the Nordic region, you may have noticed lesson number 1, denial is weakness. Denial prevents us from solving our greatest challenges. That's something that I think we can learn from the Nordic countries is looking at the problems that we face with clear eyes. And the threat to our democracy in the United States of America, and we can look at January 6th, for example, and there are more and more of this evidence that our lack of pushing back against consolidation of power and authoritarianism and the erosion of our democracy, it's playing out right in front of our faces. And a big difference that I see in the Nordic countries is that the idea of democracy is not political. It is a shared project. Across political spectrum, they say, we want democracy. I'm not so sure that's the case here in the United States anymore. And so this is something and that's scary. So when we talk about the erosion of democracy, I think in large part it's because we have a major political party that's actually very anti-democracy in the United States of America. And that is not the case in the Nordic countries. There are some ugly parties in the Nordic countries, and there is some extreme racism that we see in the Nordic countries. But it seems like across the political spectrum, the idea of democracy is really, folks feel that that's a common project. And we need that here in the United States.
One of the comments in the chat is about the lack of social trust, that so much of what you see in the Nordic countries is dependent on people having that. And so how does one build it, build social trust? Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And then the other question to tackle, there's much concern about education in the chat, and the reform, the so-called reform movements in education to privatize rather than really stand behind and make public education better. Do you have a comment for either of those statements?
Yes, certainly. On the first one, on trust, what an astute comment. And I mentioned the Nordic Council of Ministers before, and very recently they put out a report, and it was titled Trust, the Nordic Gold. And certainly many of these universal systems, they depend upon trust. But we could also see how they also facilitate and enable and foster and build trust. And here's where I have a lesson for us here in the United States. The way the Nordics have committed to universal access to childcare through very heavy subsidies for childcare. And these aren't, it's not like the Nordics are setting up Soviet-run childcare facilities. It can still be private, but everybody gets a heavy subsidy. Doesn't matter how little or much money you have, to ensure that every single child across the Nordic countries can go to a good quality childcare. Really incredible, wonderful things happen there that include also, you look at the fabric of how do we build trust in a place where it's so stretched. Well, I would suggest that our common project of our children is the greatest way that we can come together. And folks of different backgrounds, if they meet at a childcare facility, and my kid's there and your kid's there, and to the degree that those childcare facilities can be more mixed from every economic, every different kind of demographic. And this is what we see, for example, in Copenhagen, where the child of an unemployed person, the child of a janitor, the child of a CEO can go to the same childcare facility. They can all afford it. And I had personal experience here at the UC Berkeley childcare, where my Mikkel and Jonas went for a number of years, because a lot of students that had children, might be an 18, 19-year-old who has a child, their child was in there. These are people I just would not have had the opportunity to meet, and I got to know them. And I saw how they cared about my child and how I cared about their child. That's at the roots of how we can build trust between folks. So I'd say invest in children, and it's not just because kids need access to childcare, it actually can build trust. And this idea here also with the second point, privatizing. You know, our fundamental belief in markets in the United States of America is scary. Markets work really well in certain domains. But in the words of the economist Arthur Okun, he said, in a capitalistic society, the markets need their place. And the markets need to be kept in their place. And this is something that I've seen the Nordic countries haven't looked at markets with an ideological zest. Everything needs to be market driven, which oftentimes in the end is also a question about power. But where do markets work well? And where they work well, let's use them. Where they don't work well, let's establish universal systems. It's that pragmatic brick by brick building of the Nordic model over the 20th century. It didn't just happen overnight. It was pragmatic. Let's try this out. Did it work? Let's do more of it. Did it not work? Let's do less. And collecting data all the way. So they could be data driven, very pragmatic. There's a lot of inspiration that we can draw and a lot of learnings from that approach.
Robert, my computer just ran out of power. And so the last question is about immigration and how immigration has had an impact on the Nordic countries and positive freedoms.
Yes. So Susan's power just ran out here. So the question, she came into the room in person. I see you on Zoom and now I see you as a human. This is wonderful to get a little bit of human interaction here. Question about immigration and in reference to the Nordic countries. And here we do see some real differences between the Nordic countries and approaches to immigration. And in the interest of time and also me stepping too far out on a limb, I'll say this is one of the greatest challenges that the Nordic countries certainly face, is how to effectively deal with immigration and people coming from very challenging places, war-torn areas where they have all kinds of traumas. What support can we offer to these individuals, and how to ensure that folks actually have a good opportunity at just getting some stability in life? And we've seen a lot of failures in the Nordic countries as we have elsewhere as well. So I think there are a lot of lessons that the Nordics had to learn when it comes to immigration, without question. Do I bring it to a close now that I'm so, Susan? Friends here in the audience, personally in human form, and friends you who I trust are human beings, I see your lovely faces here. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, please, and I hope you do, please Google Nordic Center Berkeley, sign up for our mailing list, and you'll continue to receive information from us through that. So with that, I bid you all tak. Thank you so very much. Thank you.